Everyone in Flint Creek told Wren Alcott she was crazy. She was building a house inside a rusted iron pipe. They were right about one thing. Nobody had ever done it before. Subscribe before you keep reading. You will want to see where this goes. The drive from Denver to Flint Creek took 11 hours, and Wren Alcott spent most of it in silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that settles in after you've already said everything worth saying, and nobody listened. The kind that follows you out of a conference room after your badge has been deactivated, and your keycard no longer opens the parking garage. She drove with both hands on the wheel, her jaw set, her dark eyes fixed on the highway as it slowly traded interstate concrete for two-lane blacktop, then blacktop for gravel, then gravel for frozen mud that crunched under her tires like broken glass. Montana, in October, had a way of making Denver feel like a different planet. The mountains here didn't perform for tourists. They simply stood, indifferent and enormous, and let the cold roll off them in long, invisible waves that found every gap in a coat, every crack in a windshield seal, every unguarded moment of doubt. Wren had plenty of those. She had been 22 when she took the job at Crestline HVAC Solutions, fresh out of her technician certification and hungry to prove herself in a field where most of the other faces were older, louder, and male. She had been good at the work, better than good. She could read a building's thermal behavior the way some people read weather. She understood pressure differentials and airflow dynamics, not just as equations but as physical intuitions, things she felt in her hands when she ran them along a duct seam or pressed her palm flat against a return vent. For 2 years, she had done everything right. She had shown up early, filed clean reports, kept her mouth shut when the senior techs talked over her in briefings. And then she had found the problem in the Hargrove Tower ventilation system. It wasn't subtle once you knew where to look. A series of damper failures on floors 12 through 17, improperly commissioned during the retrofit, were allowing carbon monoxide from the parking structure below to migrate upward through the supply air. Not enough to trigger alarms, enough over months to cause headaches, fatigue, and cognitive fog in the building's residents. Most of them elderly, most of them already dismissing their symptoms as age. She had documented it carefully. She had brought it to her supervisor, a man named Paul Gretsch, with a 12-page report and 3 weeks of air quality logs. Gretsch had looked at the report, then looked at her, then told her the findings were inconclusive and that raising the issue externally would constitute a breach of client confidentiality. 2 weeks later, she was called into HR and told her position was being eliminated due to restructuring. Her severance was 2 weeks' pay and a non-disparagement agreement she refused to sign. She drove north with $400 in her checking account, a toolbox in the bed of the truck, and the address of a piece of land in Flint Creek, Montana, that had belonged to her grandfather and, after his death 6 years ago, to her grandmother Edna, who had held on to it through 3 separate purchase offers. With the quiet stubbornness of someone waiting for a reason she hadn't yet been given. Edna had told her on the phone, before she left Denver, that the farm account, untouched for 2 years since Harold's medical bills had been settled, could cover materials if Wren kept receipts and kept the work honest. When Wren pulled up the long dirt track and saw the old house sitting in the gray afternoon light, the sagging porch, the dark windows, the woodpile stacked against the south wall, by someone who clearly hadn't been there in months, she sat in the truck for a long moment without moving. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something easier, maybe. Something that looked less like the physical manifestation of starting over. Then the front door opened, and Edna Alcott stepped out onto the porch in a flannel shirt and work boots, 78 years old and steady as a fence post. And she looked at her granddaughter the way she always had, like she had been expecting her. Like this moment had always been part of a plan Wren simply hadn't been told about yet. "Took you long enough," Edna said. Wren climbed out of the truck, her boots breaking through the thin crust of frozen mud, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like recognition, like the land itself had seen her before and was simply acknowledging her return. She grabbed her toolbox from the bed and walked toward the porch. "The land doesn't need a rich person," Edna said as Wren reached the steps. She reached out and touched her granddaughter's face once, briefly, with a rough, warm hand. It needs someone who knows how to listen to it. Wren didn't answer. She looked out across the frozen field, the distant tree line, the sky pressing down low and heavy with the particular gray that meant real cold was coming. She had nothing left to lose, which meant, she realized, that she had nothing left to protect her from trying. Wren did not arrive in Flint Creek with a radical plan. She arrived with competence, and for a while, competence seemed like enough. The farmhouse had good bones. Her grandfather Harold had built it in the late 60s from lodgepole pine, and the structure was sound. The chinking had deteriorated in places, and two of the window frames had warped enough to let in drafts she could feel without instruments. But these were fixable problems. She spent the first 2 weeks fixing them. She resealed every window frame with closed-cell foam and exterior caulk. She stripped the old fiberglass bats from the attic and replaced them with blown-in cellulose at R49, 3 times the original value. She installed a new cast-iron wood stove with a properly sized flue and a fresh air intake that drew combustion air from outside rather than from the living space. She weather-stripped every door, installed a thermal break under the entry threshold, and wrapped the crawl-space foundation vents with rigid foam board. When she was finished, the house met or exceeded every standard in the 2009 Montana Residential Energy Code. She was proud of the work. It was clean, methodical, correct. Then the cold came in earnest. The first serious cold front arrived in the 3rd week of November, dropping temperatures to -14 Fahrenheit overnight, and Wren discovered that correct and sufficient were not the same thing. She woke at 4 in the morning to find the interior temperature at 41 degrees. The stove had burned down to coals in the night, and despite the insulation, despite the sealed windows, despite everything she had done right, the cold had simply walked through the walls the way water finds its level, not through any single gap, but through the aggregate inefficiency of a flat-walled, square-cornered structure that had never been designed to hold heat the way a vessel holds liquid. She rebuilt the fire and sat beside it wrapped in 2 sleeping bags, watching her breath cloud in the firelight, and did what she always did when a system failed. She stopped reacting and started analyzing. She ran the numbers in her head. A standard wood frame wall with fiberglass insulation has an effective R value of perhaps 13 to 15 when you account for thermal bridging through the studs. Her cellulose upgrade had helped, but the studs were still there, and every stud was a conductive highway, connecting the warm interior to the frozen exterior. The nails in the walls were the same tiny radiators, drawing warmth from the air and dumping it into the wood and out into the Montana night. The geometry of the house was working against her. Heat from the stove rose, accumulated at the ceiling, and conducted straight out through the roof. The walls presented 4 flat surfaces that could reflect radiant energy, but chaotically, inefficiently, bouncing it around until it found an exit. She was not heating a contained space. She was heating a volume with holes in it, and no amount of code-compliant installation was going to change the fundamental physics of a box. By December, her firewood supply was dropping at a rate that alarmed her. She had budgeted for what Edna told her was a typical Montana winter. But this winter, the coldest in 2 decades, the radio said, was not typical, and the gap between her budget and reality was widening with every cord she burned. The money she had brought from Denver was almost gone. She could not afford to buy more wood. She could not afford to leave. She sat one night with Edna at the kitchen table, both of them in their coats, a single lantern between them, and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has done everything right and still failed. Edna watched her granddaughter's face for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Your grandfather left some things in the back room. The wooden chest under the workbench. He told me once that when the right person came along, they'd know what to do with what's inside." Wren looked up. Edna's expression gave nothing away. "He was a stubborn man," Edna said. "Stubborn and quiet, and usually right about 20 years before anyone else caught up to him." She stood, patted Wren's hand once, and went to bed. Wren sat alone in the cold kitchen for another hour before she got up and went to find the chest. The chest was a simple wooden box, dovetailed at the corners, with a hasp latch that had rusted half shut. Wren worked it open with a flathead screwdriver and lifted the lid to find a stack of composition notebooks. The old kind, black and white marbled covers, the kind used in schools in the 60s and 70s. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, were a set of drafting tools, a compass, 2 triangles, a worn mechanical pencil with the eraser replaced so many times the ferrule had been bent back and recrimped at least 3 times. Harold James Alcott had worked for 30 years as a boiler maintenance technician at the Blackfoot River paper mill outside Missoula. Wren had known this, the way you know things about grandparents without really thinking about them, as a fact, not a reality. Sitting on the cold floor of the back room with the notebooks open across her knees, she began to understand what 30 years of maintaining industrial boilers had actually meant to him. The notebooks were filled with careful, precise observations, temperatures at different points in boiler housings, heat retention measurements taken at 6-hour intervals, notes on the behavior of fire brick at different thermal loads. His handwriting was small and consistent, the handwriting of someone who had learned early that space on a page was not unlimited. He had been watching the way heat moved, and he had been watching it for decades. And, by the 4th notebook, dated 1983, his observations had begun to coalesce into something else. He had started drawing. The sketches were careful and dimensioned. A cylinder on a stone foundation, cross-sections showing layers, an outer iron shell, a gap, a sand fill, an inner brick wall. Notes in the margins. Fire brick holds heat 812 Rs after fire is banked. Sand gap prevents conduction to shell. Curved wall focuses radiant energy inward. Geometry is the key. And on one page, a note that made Wren sit very still. A vessel designed to contain steam already knows how to contain warmth. The engineering problem is the same. Containment. He had understood it. She could see in the progression of the notebooks exactly when the idea had crystallized. A specific afternoon in September 1985, based on the date at the top of the page. When he had written 4 pages of calculations without stopping, the handwriting slightly larger than usual, the way handwriting gets when the mind is moving faster than the hand can follow. He had known, and then, in the last notebook, dated 1987, on the final written page, she found the sentence Edna had apparently known was there. Maybe in 20 years people will understand. I only hope by then there's still land to try it on. People will laugh. I'm not sure I have enough left not to care what they think. He had drawn the house. He had understood the physics. And he had talked himself out of it because he was afraid of being laughed at. Wren closed the notebook and held it in her lap for a long time. The cold pressed in around her. She thought about Paul Gretsch's face when she had laid her 12-page report on his desk. She thought about the HR meeting. She thought about the non-disparagement agreement she had refused to sign, not because she planned to say anything, but because being told she couldn't have clarified something important about who she was. She thought about what it cost a person to know something true and stay quiet about it. Then she got up, took the notebooks to the kitchen table, and started working through the calculations. 3 days later, she drove to Missoula to find a boiler shell. She stopped first at the county library and spent 2 hours reading Montana property law. Then she drove to the industrial district on the south side of the city, to a yard she had heard about from a millwright she had worked with in Denver, a place called Copperhead Yard, run by a man named Dwayne Stull, who was said to have more decommissioned industrial hardware than anyone in the state. She found it without difficulty. The entrance was a gap in a chain-link fence marked by a hand-painted sign, and beyond it lay several acres of retired machinery, pressure vessels, heat exchangers, lengths of pipe, the skeletal frames of industrial dryers. It smelled of rust and cold metal and old oil. She walked the yard for 40 minutes, Dwayne Stull following at a distance with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing, watching her the way men in yards like this often watched women who showed up alone, waiting for the moment she would ask for a man to help her figure out what she was looking at. She found the shell near the back of the yard, a decommissioned fire tube boiler from a paper mill, which struck her as fitting, 12 feet in diameter and 20 feet long, with a wall thickness of 1/4 inch, the riveted seams solid, the steel surface streaked with rust but structurally sound. The fire tubes had been cut and pulled during decommissioning, Standard procedure at the mill, Dwayne told her, when a shell was stripped for scrap value, leaving the interior hollow and clean, the tube sheet at each end still solid. The openings already welded over with plate steel by whoever had done the salvage work. She pulled out her calipers, took 4 measurements, checked the wall thickness at 3 points, examined the seam quality on the near end. Then she turned to Dwayne Stoll and said, "I need this delivered to a property in Flint Creek. What are you asking for the shell?" Dwayne Stoll looked at her. Then he looked past her, toward the entrance. "You with somebody?" he said. Wren held his gaze. She reached into her jacket and laid Harold's cross-section drawing on the hood of the nearby truck, dimensioned, annotated, precise. She pointed to the shell specification noted in the margin. $400, Dwayne said after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to be embarrassing. "I'll have somebody help you load it." Getting the shell to Flint Creek required a flatbed, 2 come-alongs, and the reluctant assistance of Wade Pruitt, who farmed the adjacent 40 acres and who came over not because he had been asked, but because the sound of a 12-foot iron cylinder being maneuvered off a flatbed with a 2-ton come-along and a single operator was the kind of sound that brought neighbors out of their houses in rural Montana, whether they wanted to get involved or not. The foundation had taken her the better part of 2 weeks in October, before the hard freeze set in. She had started it the week she arrived, working the ground while it was still soft enough to set stone, because her grandfather's notebooks had specified the dimensions exactly, and she had understood from the first reading that the foundation had to be right before anything else could be. Wade was 28, lean and weathered in the way of men who had spent their entire lives outdoors, and he stood at the edge of the drive with his thumbs in his belt loops, watching Wren work the chain with a competence that clearly confused him. He helped without being asked, took the second come-along handle when it became obvious the load was going to tip, and said almost nothing for 2 hours until the shell was positioned on the circular stone foundation. Wren had finished in October, level and solid on the frozen ground. "What is it?" he said finally. "A house," Wren said. Wade looked at the rust-streaked cylinder lying on its foundation in the middle of a Montana field. Then he looked at Wren. She was already pulling her notebook out of her jacket. He opened his mouth, closed it, and went home. He came back the next morning. He stood at the edge of the cleared ground, watching her work for about 20 minutes before she noticed him. "You want coffee?" she said. "Sure," he said. They stood with their cups in the cold, and she showed him the cross-section drawing and walked him through the basic physics, the firebrick thermal mass, the sand insulation layer, the curved geometry that focused radiant heat inward rather than losing it to flat walls. He didn't say he believed it. He asked 3 questions, all of them technically specific, and she answered each one with enough precision that he visibly recalibrated his assessment of the situation. Clint Barrow arrived on the 4th day. He was 50, built like someone who had been swinging a framing hammer since adolescence, and he carried with him the specific authority of a man who had been the person everyone in the county called when something needed to be built correctly. He stood at the property line and looked at the cylinder and the small figure working beside it, and he said, loud enough to carry, "You're going to freeze to death in that thing." Wren looked up briefly. "The iron is the weather skin," she said, "not the comfort layer." She went back to work. Clint Barrow's expression shifted in a way that was not quite amusement and not quite anger. He left. He came back 2 days later with Garrett Finch. Garrett Finch was the Flint Creek County building inspector, a man who wore his authority the way some men wear cologne, applied heavily and in advance of arrival. He walked the property with a clipboard. He issued the stop work order on a Tuesday morning, citing lack of residential construction permit and non-compliance with standard habitable structure requirements. Wren, read the order carefully. She said nothing. She drove to the county library, where she spent 3 weeks reading the Montana Code Annotated, Title 76, and every relevant county ordinance she could locate. On a Thursday afternoon in early December, she appeared at the county building office with a 12-page filing, which Garrett Finch would later privately acknowledge was the most precisely cited document he had received from a non-attorney in his career, reclassifying the structure as an agricultural accessory building on a parcel exceeding 5 acres, used for personal non-commercial habitation. The stop work order was withdrawn on a Friday. Clint Barrow was standing in the hardware store parking lot when he saw Wren's truck drive past that afternoon. He watched it go without expression. Wade Pruitt, who had witnessed the whole sequence, appeared at Wren's property the following Monday morning with a wheelbarrow and a bag of fire clay mortar. He still did not say he believed it would work. He said, "Walk me through the brick laying. I want to understand the spacing on the inner wall." Wren handed him a trowel. The inner brick wall went up slowly, the way good work goes. Not because it was difficult, but because it required precision that couldn't be hurried. Each course of fire brick had to be level and plumb, and the 6-inch thickness and the 4-inch gap between the brick and the iron shell had to be maintained consistently all the way around. Wren had built a simple jig from scrap lumber to hold the spacing, and she moved it as she went, checking the gap with her fingers at every third brick, the way her grandfather's notebook had specified. Wade Pruitt learned quickly. He had the mechanical intelligence of someone who had grown up fixing things, rather than replacing them, and by the second day, he was setting bricks with a consistency that matched hers. He still asked questions constantly, not skeptical ones anymore, but operational ones. The questions of someone who wants to understand a system deeply enough to troubleshoot it. On the third morning, he brought coffee, and they stood in the unfinished shell in the gray pre-dawn, and he asked her about the sand layer. She explained it the way her grandfather had written it. The trapped air pockets, the prevention of convective heat loss, the way dry sand behaves as a thermal break between two materials of different conductivity. He nodded slowly. "And that's enough," he said. "It's what the original design calls for," Wren said. She paused. But no, she had been thinking about the sand layer since she had first read her grandfather's notebooks. Harold had specified fine dry river sand, but Wren had been running her own numbers, and she had identified a variable Harold hadn't had access to, a 2001 study on granular insulation composites from the University of Minnesota that she had found in an engineering database at the Missoula Public Library. Recycled glass cullet, crushed glass from bottles and windows, had a thermal conductivity approximately 30% lower than clean sand when packed at the same density. It trapped smaller, more uniform air pockets, and unlike sand, it didn't compact over time in ways that could create convective channels. She had called the Darrow Falls Recycling Center the previous week. They had 3 tons of crushed glass they were storing because the nearest processing facility had closed, and they had nowhere to send it. She could have as much as she needed for the cost of hauling it, she told Wade. He was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather didn't use that," he said. "My grandfather didn't have the data," she said. "Or the recycling center." She watched something shift in his face, not just the processing of a technical point, but something larger. The recognition that an idea could be right and still be improvable, that a person could stand on someone else's good work and reach higher. He helped her haul the glass. They poured it in layers, tamping it carefully with a length of iron pipe, and by the end of the week, the annular gap between the brick wall and the iron shell was filled completely. A continuous ring of insulation that would, when the brick reached operating temperature, hold the heat stored inside away from the cold outer skin, with a consistency no sand alone could match. The stovepipe installation was the last technical challenge. Harold's notebooks had specified a horizontal run, routing the flue laterally across the interior dome before exiting, forcing the combustion gases to radiate their heat into the structure before escaping. Wren extended the concept further, adding a simple baffle at the exit point that created a slight back pressure, slowing the gas flow by an estimated 12% and increasing the dwell time of hot gases inside the structure accordingly. She installed the fresh air intake baffled to prevent downdraft and a small exhaust vent at the peak of the dome to create slow controlled air circulation. She fitted the small cast iron stove in the center of the floor. She installed the 2 small windows and the door, heavily insulated, with a magnetic compression seal she had machined from a length of steel bar stock in Edna's garage. When she was done, she stood outside in the November cold and looked at the finished structure. The rust-streaked iron cylinder sitting on its stone foundation in the Montana field, and felt not triumph, but something quieter. A kind of recognition. She went inside, closed the door, and lit the stove for the first time. The wood caught immediately. She sat on the floor with her back against the curved brick wall and waited. Within an hour, the brick nearest the stove was warm to the touch. Within 4, the far side of the wall held a steady heat she could feel radiating against her face from 6 feet away. She did not move for a long time. The winter of 2009 in Flint Creek was not a steady cold. It was a series of violent oscillations that the old-timers called a continental polar collapse. Days of unseasonal warmth, followed by temperature drops of 60 degrees or more in the span of a single afternoon. The kind of weather that found every weakness in a structure and exploited it without mercy. Wren had been living in the iron house for 3 weeks when the first hard cycle hit. She had just banked the stove for the night when she heard the wind change. A shift from the southwest to the northwest that she felt in her bones before she heard it in the trees. And within 2 hours, the temperature outside had dropped from 28 to -19. She lay in her bed in the dark and listened. The wind struck the iron shell with a sound like a flat hand on a drum, present definite, immediately absorbed. Inside, a candle on the table beside her bed held its flame upright, barely shivering. The temperature held at 64 degrees. She slept. 2 miles down the valley, Clint Barrow was awake. The wind had found a new gap near his chimney flashing. The 3rd time this winter it had opened up, and he had stuffed it with rags, and then with foam backer rod, and still the knife-edge draft came through, dropping the temperature in the corner of his living room to 31 degrees, while the stove ran cherry red 6 feet away. He burned half a cord in a single night. He was doing math he didn't want to do about how much wood he had left and how much winter remained. Jody Holt arrived at Wren's door on a Tuesday morning in late January with a camera bag over her shoulder and the slightly embarrassed energy of someone who knows they've been sent on an errand they're not proud of. She wrote for the Darrow Falls Courier, which she had been doing for 6 years, and she was good at her job, which meant she knew a setup when she was handed one. Clint Barrow had called the paper and suggested, not too subtly, that there was an interesting human interest story to be told about a young woman from the city who had convinced herself that living in a metal pipe was a reasonable housing solution. The implication was clear. Jody had taken the assignment because it was an assignment and she needed the column inches. She knocked on the iron door. Wren opened it, looked at the camera bag and said, "Come in, I just made coffee." Jody Holt stepped inside. She stopped. The interior was smaller than the exterior dimensions suggested. The brick wall had taken 18 inches from the radius all the way around, and the curve of the ceiling pressed down at the center, where the dome met the horizontal run of the stovepipe. But the proportions felt right in a way she couldn't immediately explain. The curved walls drew the eye inward rather than out, and the low light from the 2 small windows, set opposite each other at roughly the midpoint of the cylinder, fell evenly across the table. 2 chairs, a narrow shelf of books, and the small cast iron stove sitting at the center of the floor like a period at the end of a sentence. She had been in a lot of homes in 6 years of feature writing, and she had developed an involuntary sense for the thermal character of a space, the specific quality of the air, whether warmth was concentrated or distributed, whether comfort was being actively generated or passively sustained. In this space, the warmth came from everywhere at once. It was not the aggressive heat of a stove. It was pervasive, even, and completely still. There was no draft. There was no cold corner. The small windows were clean, no frost on the interior glass. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment with her camera bag over her shoulder and let herself simply feel it. Then she looked at the stove. It was barely lit, a few coals glowing at the bottom, no active flame, nothing that should have been capable of producing what she was feeling. She turned to Wren. Wren handed her a coffee and sat down at the table. Jody sat across from her. She did not open her notebook. She reached into her bag, found her recorder, and turned it off. "Where did you learn to do this?" she said. Then in the middle of February, Edna Alcott got sick. It started as a cough, the dry, persistent kind that comes on in cold weather, and became, within a week, a bacterial pneumonia that put her in the Darrow Falls clinic for 3 days and sent her home with antibiotics and a doctor's instruction that she was not to be in a cold, damp environment. Her house on the eastern end of the property, the house where she had lived for 50 years, had the particular damp cold of old construction, the kind that settles into the walls and never fully leaves. Wren drove to the clinic, loaded Edna's overnight bag into the truck, and drove her directly to the iron house. She did not ask. Edna did not argue. Within a week, the color had come back to Edna's face. The cough was still there, but thinning. The doctor, who had expected to see her back in 2 weeks, came at 3 weeks and stood in the doorway of the iron house for a moment before he crossed the threshold, recalibrating his expectations. "The air is dry," he said, "and warm without being hot." "Yes," Wren said. The doctor looked at Edna, who was sitting in a chair by the table doing a crossword puzzle in her regular ink pen, a thing she had not been able to do in her own house in 2 months because her hands had been too cold and too stiff. "Keep her here," he said simply. Wren looked at Edna. Edna did not look up from her crossword. "I'm not going anywhere," Edna said. February 14th brought the coldest day of the year. The thermometer at the Darrow Falls feed store read -32 at noon and by 2 in the afternoon. A wind had come up from the north that drove the wind chill to something the radio described as life-threatening, with the careful understatement of people who understood that saying the actual number would cause panic. Garrett Finch had been at the county offices in Darrow Falls until 5, later than he usually stayed, finishing a set of inspection reports that had backed up during the holidays. He drove the 12 miles back toward Flint Creek in his county-issue F-250, with the heater running full blast and the seat warmer on high, which is why he didn't notice immediately that the temperature inside the cab was dropping. The heater core had been failing slowly for 2 weeks, a hairline crack in the solder joint that he had been meaning to get looked at, the way people are always meaning to attend to the small failures that precede the large ones. At 6 miles out of town, the system gave up entirely. The temperature in the cab dropped 10 degrees in 5 minutes. Garrett drove on, telling himself it wasn't that bad, the way people tell themselves things aren't that bad until they have to stop the vehicle on the side of a gravel road in -32 wind chill, and realize that the nearest occupied structure is a mile away through open fields, and that they are not dressed for what is currently happening outside their window. He took stock of what he had: a Carhartt jacket, work gloves, wool socks, and a hat. Not nothing, but not enough for a mile in this. He got out of the truck and looked both directions down the empty road and identified the lights of the nearest property. He knew whose it was. He stood for a moment in the wind with that specific knowledge sitting in his chest alongside the cold. He had withdrawn the stop work order under legal obligation, not because he had been wrong, or so he had told himself. He had not been back since. He turned up his collar and walked. By the time he reached the iron door, his face was numb from the cheekbones down, and his fingers had stopped responding to fine motor instructions. He knocked with the flat of his palm because making a fist was no longer an option. The door opened. Wren Alcott looked at him, his red face, his stiff hands, his expression of a man who has walked a mile through -30 wind and is now standing at the door of the person he had tried to shut down, and she stepped back from the door without a word. He came inside. He stood in the middle of the room and did not move because what was happening to him required his full attention. The warmth was not hitting him from one direction. It was coming from every direction simultaneously. The curved walls, radiating inward from all sides, and his body, which had been in pure survival mode for the last 20 minutes, simply stopped fighting and began to receive. He became aware of other things gradually: the stillness of the air, the absence of sound from the wind, 2 coffee cups on the table, a crossword puzzle book open on a chair, an old woman asleep on a cot near the far wall, breathing quietly and evenly. He took off his gloves with difficulty. He looked at the stove. It held a low, steady fire, not hot, not dramatic, simply present. He pulled out his watch, a Hamilton Field watch his father had given him, and held it in his palm. The watch had been keeping time, but the oil in the movement had been thickening since he had left the car, and the second hand was moving in irregular spasmodic jumps. the mechanism fighting its own congealed lubricant. He stood there, hand open, and watched. The warmth of the room worked into the metal of the case. 30 seconds. A minute. The second hand shuddered, caught, and began to move, cleanly, smoothly, sweeping the full circle without interruption. He stared at it. He had spent his professional life evaluating structures, and he understood in that moment, viscerally, not theoretically, that what he was holding was a measurement instrument, and what it was measuring was the difference between the world outside and what this woman had built. When Ren came back from the kitchen with a mug of coffee, he was still standing there with his palm open, watching the second-hand sweep. He looked up, the face of a man who has organized his professional identity around the concept of knowing things, looked back at her with all of that temporarily suspended. "I was wrong about the structure," he said. His voice was even. "But I was more wrong about the way I treated you from the beginning. I had decided before I arrived. I never actually listened." Ren held out the coffee mug. He took it. "The stove was almost out when you knocked," she said. "I know," he said. He wrapped both hands around the mug, and for a moment they simply stood in the warmth that had been accumulating in the curved fire brick walls for the past 12 hours. Jody Holt's article ran in the Darrow Falls Courier on the 1st of March, the same week the temperature finally climbed above freezing and stayed there. It was not the article Clint Barrow had anticipated. He had expected something gently condescending, the kind of local interest piece that treats eccentricity as charm and leaves the subject slightly diminished. What Jody wrote was a careful, technically serious account of a 24-year-old woman who had applied industrial thermodynamics to residential construction in a way that produced measurable results, and she had the measurements to prove it. Interior temperature logs maintained throughout the winter, firewood consumption records compared against neighboring properties of similar square footage, the doctor's observations about Edna Alcott's recovery. The article ran 1,400 words, and Jody had not wasted a single one of them. She sent a copy to the University of Montana's College of Engineering in Missoula as a matter of professional habit. She had a contact there, a Dr. Raymond Oakes, who had helped her fact-check technical articles in the past. Dr. Oakes read it on a Thursday evening and emailed Jody before 10 o'clock that night, asking for Ren Alcott's contact information. He was a professor of thermal systems engineering who had been teaching heat transfer theory for 22 years, and had, in that time, come to believe that the gap between what the research literature knew about passive thermal mass systems and what was actually being built in the American West was one of the more persistent and unnecessary failures in applied building science. He drove to Flint Creek the following Saturday. He spent 3 hours in the iron house with Ren's notebooks and Harold's notebooks spread across the table. He was 60, compact, and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned not to waste energy on theatrics. "Your glass cullet layer," he said, at one point, tapping a page of Ren's calculations. "That's not in the original design." "My grandfather didn't have the data," Ren said. Dr. Oakes looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "he didn't. Clint Barrow appeared on a Thursday in late March. He did not knock so much as materialize." Ren looked up from the workbench where she was cleaning tools, and he was standing at the edge of the cleared ground, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the iron house with an expression that had cost him something. He was holding an envelope. She came out to meet him. He held out the envelope without preamble. It was his February heating bill. She looked at the number, which was significant. "I didn't come to say I was wrong," he said. His jaw was set in the way of a man who has rehearsed a speech and is deciding in real time how much of it he actually has the courage to deliver. "I came to say I want to understand why it works." Ren looked at him for a moment. He had called the county inspector to shut her down. He had brought a reporter to embarrass her. He had stood at the property line and told her she would freeze to death with the confidence of someone who considers a prediction to be the same as a fact. She thought about all of this in the approximately 3 seconds between his words and her response. "Come in," she said. "I'll start from the beginning." She did not mention any of the rest of it. Wade Pruitt, watching from across the fence line, saw Clint Barrow follow Ren Alcott through the iron door and disappear inside, and stood there for a moment with an unreadable expression. He had been helping Ren 2 or 3 days a week since December. He had learned more about thermal dynamics in 4 months than in his previous 28 years. He went back to his fence pair. Dr. Raymond Oakes made his proposal in April, sitting at Ren's table with the notebooks stacked beside his coffee cup. The University of Montana's engineering library wanted to acquire Harold James Alcott's technical notebooks as a primary source document, an original record of empirical field research conducted outside the academic system, which was exactly the kind of material that the library's Special Collections Division had been trying to document before it disappeared into estate sales and dumpsters. The acquisition would be permanent. The notebooks would be preserved, cataloged, and available to researchers. Ren listened to the whole proposal. Then she said, "The authorship credit, Dr." Oakes looked at her. "The catalog entry," she said, "the finding aid. Whatever it's called when someone looks it up. What does it say?" "We would note the donor's name." "Not the donor," Ren said. "The author, the person who did the work." She leaned forward slightly. "His name is Harold James Alcott. He was a boiler maintenance technician at the Blackfoot River paper mill. He worked there for 30 years. He lived in Flint Creek, Montana." That's what the record should say. Not folk engineering, not anonymous source, not regional technical tradition. A man did this work. He has a name. Dr. Oakes was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable condition," he said. "More than reasonable," Ren said. "It's the condition." Agreed. The catalog entry, when it was finalized, read, "Alcott, Harold James, 1931 to 2003. Technical notebooks on passive thermal mass construction, 1968 to 1987. Flint Creek, Montana. Boiler maintenance technician, Blackfoot River paper mill, Missoula, MT." It was a small thing in one sense, a line of text in a library database that most people would never read. In another sense, it was not small at all. It was the difference between a man's life's work existing in the record and not existing in the record, between his name being attached to what he knew and his knowledge floating free of him, unattributed, absorbed into the general body of things people know without knowing where the knowing came from. Wade Pruitt had his own reckoning with Harold's legacy that same spring. He had spent the winter helping Ren build her house and studying the design carefully, and by March he was convinced he understood it well enough to build his own. He sourced a smaller shell, 10 feet in diameter, from a dairy processing plant in Great Falls that was decommissioning equipment. He laid his own circular foundation. He built his own fire brick inner wall with the correct 6-inch thickness and 4-inch gap. He installed his own horizontal flue run. What he did not do was add the glass cullet layer. He had looked at the recycled glass and made a quiet judgment that it was probably not as significant as Ren had calculated, that the extra effort of hauling and processing it was not worth the incremental gain. The following November, he ran his first winter in the new house. It was warm, significantly warmer than his old place. He was satisfied. He was also, by January, aware that his firewood consumption was running about 30% higher than Ren's, a difference he had not expected and could not initially explain. He came to her with his numbers on a cold afternoon in February. He spread his consumption log on her table and said, "There's a gap, and I don't know where it is." Ren looked at the numbers. She did not say what she could have said. She looked up at him and asked, "Which step did you leave out?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The glass. Your grandfather's design was right," she said, "and it was improvable. Both of those things are true at the same time." Wade drove to the Darrow Falls Recycling Center the following week. By spring, he had filled the gap in his annular layer, and his numbers came in line with Ren's. He did not make a production of it. He simply showed her his March consumption log when he stopped by one afternoon, and she looked at it and nodded, and they moved on to other things. The email arrived in October 2011, 2 years after Ren had first driven north from Denver with $400 and a toolbox. It came from the legal department of Crestline HVAC Solutions, the company that had eliminated her position for reasons of restructuring approximately 25 months earlier. The subject line read, Commercial Licensing Inquiry, Cylindrical Passive Thermal Mass Residential Construction System. She read it once, then set her coffee down and read it again. The company had learned about her work through Dr. Oakes's recently published paper in the Journal of Building Science, which had cited the Alcott notebooks and described Wren's construction as a working proof of concept for a passive thermal mass system with measurable performance advantages over code minimum frame construction in northern climate zones. Crestline was interested in acquiring exclusive commercial rights to the design methodology. The email was polite, professionally worded, and carefully structured to feel like an opportunity. Wren read it a third time, and then sat for a while looking out the small window of the iron house at the October light falling across the Montana field. She thought about her grandfather, who had understood the same distinction and arrived at the opposite answer, and what that had cost the world in the 22 years his notebook spent in a chest. She drafted her reply carefully. The design methodology you are inquiring about is not mine to license. It was developed by Harold James Alcott of Flint Creek, Montana, between 1968 and 1987, and its development is documented in his technical notebooks, which are now held in the permanent collection of the University of Montana Engineering Library. They were donated by the Alcott family, with an express dedication to the public domain under 17 U.S.C. paragraph 106, executed as part of the acquisition agreement. No commercial rights exist to convey. The design belongs to everyone. She sent the email. Then she opened a new document and began typing the full technical specifications for the construction system, annotated with her additions and modifications, written in plain language clear enough to be useful to someone with no formal engineering training. She included Harold's original calculations and her own. She included the glass cullet modification with the sourcing information for the Darrow Falls Recycling Center. She included the stovepipe routing specifications and the fresh air intake baffling details. She posted it to a public server with a link she sent to Dr. Oakes, to Jody Holt, and to 3 forums for owner-builder construction she had found online. Within 6 months, Dr. Oakes had received 47 inquiries from people in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Minnesota asking about the design. 12 of them resulted in verified construction projects that first year. Wade Pruitt helped build 2 of them himself. Clint Barrow, who had spent the intervening 2 years thinking more carefully about what he didn't know than he had in the previous 20, helped with 3. On a cold afternoon in November 2011, Wren sat in the iron house with Edna, who was fully recovered and had not left the cylindrical room voluntarily since February of 2009 except to collect her mail. The stove held a low fire. The brick walls held their heat. Outside, the first real snow of the season was coming down in the particular Montana way. Steady, silent, thorough, and the temperature was dropping toward the kind of cold that made the county radio remind people to bring their animals in. Inside, a candle on the table between them did not flicker. Wren was reading. Edna was working her crossword in ink. The butter on the table beside Edna's coffee was soft. That one small fact. Butter soft on a table in a Montana blizzard, in a house built from a dead man's notebooks, and a young woman's refusal to accept that knowing something true was not, by itself, enough, contained everything the story was actually about. Not the iron, not the physics, the willingness to build what you know, even when no one is watching and no one believes you. Even when the only record of your work is a stack of composition notebooks in a wooden chest that might have stayed there forever if the right person hadn't been stubborn enough, or desperate enough, or simply too tired of being quiet to finally open it. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest, and let me know what part of the world you are reading this from.
When I called grandfather knew the answer. He reviewed it, calculated it, wrote it on paper, and then he put it in a chest and locked it away because he was afraid of what people would say. He lost 22 years, 22 winter. He could have been warm 22 years. That idea sat in the dark, helping nobody. When got fired for telling the truth, she lost her job, her income and her footing, but she never lost the one thing that actually mattered, the refusal to pretend she did not know what she knew. That refusal built a house that kept an old woman alive through the war winter into desert. That refusal built 40 families across Montana into warmer home. That refusal turned one man forgotten logbook into a permanent university archive with his full name on it. Here is what this story is actually teaching you. Loneliness that stay silent have no one. Expertise that never ask each other private comfort. The wood, the world does not need more people who are quietly right. It needs people willing to build what they know, even when they are standing alone in a frozen field with everyone watching and nobody believing. Your grandfather notebook is already inside you. The only question is whether you are brave enough to open it.